Yes, I'm Tom Gelton of NPR, sitting in for Diane Rehm. Diane is in Indianapolis on a visit to WFYI. She'll be back Monday. Congress pushes forward on the Keystone XL pipeline, with President Obama signaling a possible veto. The Supreme Court takes up racially based gerrymandering, and the VA announces an overhaul. The goal is to improve service to veterans. Here to discuss this week's top national stories in the Friday News Roundup, Perry Bacon of NBC News, Karen Tumulty of The Washington Post, and Olivier Knox of Yahoo News. How are you all?
Just fine. Great.
Thanks for coming in. This is going to be a great hour, I promise. You can join our conversation. 1-800-433-8850 is our phone number. drshow@wamu.org is our email. And you know how to find us on Facebook or Twitter. One other thing, you can watch us. This is the 1 hour of the week when we live stream video of our show. You can find it on our website, drshow.org. So we're officially in a lame duck Congress, but there's nothing lame about the showdown that seems to be brewing, right, Karen?
Oh, not at all. What's been interesting is the president, the day after the election, comes out and in his news conference says, I am going to use every tool available to me for every minute that remains in my presidency. And it's striking the degree to which he seems to have really meant this. On
Let's
Monday,
start with immigration.
Well, on immigration, which is probably the most sort of inflammatory of the issues that's out there, it is widely expected now that the president is going to basically make maximum use of what he believes his executive powers are to issue to an executive action, maybe as early as next week, possibly next month. But there's as many as 5 million. I've even heard 6 million people who are currently in the country illegally could be sort of freed from the worry of deportation. But beyond that, we've seen him on Monday. He came out of the gate with a very strong statement, leaning essentially on the FCC to protect net neutrality, something that caused some complaints on Capitol Hill because it would mean exercising greater regulatory powers over the telecom companies. And then on Tuesday, he announces this global warming deal with China. So this really does seem to be a president who has decided that, maybe it's in his interest not to accommodate this new Congress, but to actually pick some fights with it.
Well, Perry, let's just spend 1 minute on immigration. What Karen already sort of went through what he's likely to do. What will be the reaction on Capitol Hill? I mean, we've certainly seen some tough words from Republican leaders there.
You're going to see tough action, too, is my suspicion. So there was talk about a few months ago that maybe this action only affect maybe 1 million people or be a small election, but now we're talking about 5 million is about half of the people who are here illegally. It's about estimated by 11 to 12 million are here illegally, and we're talking about 5 to 6 million. So that's a huge number. The Republicans are surprised by that, and they're going likely to be angered by that. What can they really do? You're already hearing talk about Capitol Hill, and Boehner did not rule out some kind of fight over the government funding bill and maybe even a government shutdown over this. So I think you're going to see a really strong conflict here.
Olivier, what's the, down the road, what is the impact of this? Do the Republicans have any kind of dilemma here that if they really make a big fuss about this, it'll hurt them? I mean, what are the considerations that people on both sides of the aisle are thinking right now?
Well, Republicans actually have several dilemmas. One, currently in the immediate response to these executive orders. As Perry pointed out, John Boehner is not ruling out a shutdown, but the bulk of the Republican leadership, anyway, and the moderates that remain are arguing against that. Boehner is looking at things like another lawsuit, expanding the lawsuit he's already filed against the president. But so that's one of the early dilemmas. How do they accommodate conservatives who are eager for a shutdown fight? Down the road, though, every national Republican will tell you that the immigration issue is going to be important in 2016 and beyond. And if the party wants to remain a viable national party in that respect, they're going to have to find their own path here. This is going to put a lot of pressure on them to come up with an alternative.
Well, one thing an executive order does is it kicks the can down the road, because in 2016, with a new president, you're starting all over again, right? I mean, a new president is going to have to either do this all over again or leave it to Congress.
Well, I think the executive order doesn't lapse unless
those people aren't going to be deported. No.
Right. And so the question, but that's the big question for the next the next president, whoever he or she is, right? Do you roll this back or not? For that matter, does Congress pass legislation that supplants it? I mean, President Obama has said repeatedly now, look, you're making me do this by not acting on your own. If you pass some kind of legislation on this, then, that'll take the place of these executive orders.
Karen, you also mentioned climate, and we're going to get to that in the next hour. But to what extent can this big deal that the U.S. and China have signed to cap climate emissions be undone or be blocked by Republican opposition on Capitol Hill?
Parts of it can, but the fact is that the deal itself is not subject to it's not a treaty, so it doesn't have to be ratified
So
by
it's not
the
like
Senate.
Kyoto. Mhm.
Right. Now, Mitch McConnell is arguing that, it's not tough enough on the Chinese and it's not requiring enough of them. But the fact is that until now, one of the arguments that conservatives had used against any sort of action on the part of the United States was, well, what's the point if China's not going along? What would we be accomplishing? So it's going to be quite, I think, a big issue going forward.
Perry, one other issue that could conceivably produce a fight between the White House and Congress is President Obama's nomination of Loretta Lynch for Attorney General. First, give us a little background on Loretta Lynch. Not exactly a household name, but she does have a strong reputation.
This was a pick that felt like it was out of nowhere. I mean, as Olivia was saying earlier, Obama's sort of known for picking people in his circle, people he's known for a long time. And Miss Lynch was not that at all. One thing about her, though, is she actually went to Harvard with Eric Holder's wife, and they were in the same sorority together. So that, and also she's the head of Holder has an advisory committee for the Attorney General's office, and Lynch is at the head of that. So Lynch is not close to Obama, but she's close to Holder. She also has the advantage of, she's a U.S. attorney in the area around Brooklyn. So she has the advantage also of she doesn't have a long history of public statements that are very liberal. So it's probably easy to confirm her. So the advantage of that is she may have Holder's views, which the White House wants, but does not have Holder's record, which Republicans would oppose. So the guess is she can be confirmed pretty easily. Mm-hmm. The challenge will be, do the Republicans want to use her confirmation as a way to, they're going to ask her, do you support this immigration action? Is this legal? And the fight will be less about Lynch and more about Obama and using the confirmation process as a way to fight him.
Well, not only fight, I mean, there's a lot of lingering resentment of Eric Holder. I mean, Eric Holder's Attorney General office was a real focus of controversy and confrontation between the White House and Congress over the last few months, fast and furious and so on.
Exactly. Like Holder has leaned very heavily on trying to strike down voter ID laws essentially everywhere. And that's an issue, again, where I assume Lynch shares his point of view, and therefore Republicans want to press those kinds of issues as well. Obama has used DOJ as a way to push gay rights, voting rights, mm-hmm. a lot of things that help minorities. And that's a place where there is going to be conflict. And I'm sure the Republicans want to ask Lynch, do you agree with the steps Holder has taken, and will you take them?
Karen, do you agree that she will be confirmed in all likelihood?
I think that certainly it's going to be a lot smoother than some of the other candidates that people were talking about. And so I think it has both the element of surprise and the fact that she's been confirmed before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Olivier, there's so many issues to go through as far as potential fighting points between the White House and Congress. Another obvious one is Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. We have seen, again, a lot of statements from Republican leaders about what their intentions are with respect to rolling back or repealing that act. What are we likely to see first of all, in the lame duck Congress?
Well, in the lame duck Congress, I wouldn't expect too much. They might try to tie some steps to tinker with Obamacare to the broader funding bill that they need to pass by December 11th. The next Congress is the more interesting part, because then that's when Republican leadership have to cope with very conservative members of their caucus who want a full repeal fight, and members of their caucus who want something short of that. One of the big challenges is a total repeal would likely undo Medicaid expansion. Which has been fairly popular and fairly successful in a lot of states. And the result would be, taking away healthcare from millions of Americans. That poses a certain challenge. So we haven't yet seen the details of their strategy. That's something they're hashing out now in terms of, do they want to repeal the tax on medical devices, for instance? There are some popular items in there. medical device tax repeal being one of them, where Republicans could very credibly forge a bipartisan coalition in Congress, send it to the president, and essentially force his hand.
You know, the big threat, though, to the Affordable Care Act is coming at the moment is coming not from Capitol Hill, but from the Supreme Court, because there was a case that by saying that you could not give subsidies in states where there's a federal exchange operation, that could, in fact, make the whole law fall apart.
Right. Meanwhile, another enrollment period is beginning tomorrow. Are we going to see a smoother process this time than we've seen in the past?
The president has promised that, although it's interesting that this week we also saw HHS sort of lowering its estimates on the number of people who would actually be signing up this time around. But, again, the president has said a number of times that this time there will be no glitches.
Barry, what's your sense of this? Is this going to be is this going to start going? We didn't see as much of this in the last elections as some people were predicting we would see it being an issue.
You know, people I talk to in the ground in the States particularly say that the political rhetoric around this has subsided a little bit. The website worked. You had an estimated 10 million people get insurance over the last year. It's not the Republicans support this at all, but it's like they're less, like, the governors in various states in the South are less oppositional. They're doing less to sort of block the law from being implemented. So I think we're in a stage now where until the Supreme Court ruling happens, where there's not going to be a lot of huge news, and I think the enrollment will be better than the last time.
Perry Bacon is political reporter for NBC News. Previously, he was national political reporter at Time and the Washington Post. My other guests here in the studio are Karen Tumulty, national political reporter for the Washington Post, and Olivia Knox, chief Washington correspondent for Yahoo News. We're going to take a short break. Stay tuned. Back. I'm Tom Gelton from NPR. I'm sitting in today for Diane Rehm. This is the first hour of our Friday News Roundup. This is the hour where we talk about domestic news. My guests are Perry Bacon from NBC News, Karen Tumulty from the Washington Post, and Olivia Knox, chief Washington correspondent for Yahoo News. And before we get too far off the immigration subject, Jeremy from Alabama raises an interesting question. He's wondering about the potential effects of the kind of executive action that President Obama is talking about on people who are already in the immigration system. He is waiting to have his green card application being processed. And Olivier, he's wondering if President Obama does, executive action here, if that's going to sort of clog up the works and delay his naturalization status. Do you have any idea?
Well, one thing that we learned with the flood of underage immigrants earlier this year, one thing we learned is that it takes about 537 days from your first court appearance to see a judge a second time to get your process moving. So I would argue, first of all, that the process is clogged up currently. Mm-hmm. We haven't seen exactly what President Obama plans to do, but if the reports are accurate, it probably will not have a big impact on people who are already in the system because, at least not for green cards, because he's really talking about refocusing deportation policy to say, if you've been here, if you're the parents of someone who was born here, if you haven't committed any crimes, if you've been working here, if you've been here longer than 10 years, you don't have to worry so much about deportation. It's going to be interesting to see. Part of the plan, as reported, would let them apply for work documents, and that certainly could create a glut of applications in a system that, as I said, is already clogged up. But I would not expect to see people who are already in the system to be in too much
Okay.
trouble, in part because the president doesn't want to look for that fight. You know, if you're playing by the rules, he doesn't want to make that. He doesn't want to punish you.
I'm sure our listeners have a lot of questions or comments about the immigration subject. Remember, our phone number is 800-433-8850. But let's move on now, Karen. A big issue that this even the lame duck Congress, not even waiting for the new Congress, is determined to take up, and that is the Keystone pipeline. We could have a vote, what, today?
in the House.
In the House, is that right?
Yeah, and of course the big vote would be next week in the Senate. Something that Harry Reid had not previously allowed to happen, in part because there was a chance it could pass.
So why is he going to do it now?
To save Mary Landrieu's seat, basically. The one criticism
Who's running for re-election from
who's in a
Louisiana.
runoff for re-election in Louisiana. One criticism of Harry Reid was that the way he ran the Senate, he never allowed amendments, which meant that a lot of Democrats who really wanted to demonstrate their independence from the Obama administration had no opportunity in which to do that. They would go home and say, I'm an independent voice in Washington, and their constituents say, well, you're voting with the administration 98% of the time. This is a chance to let her do that. But the White House has already signaled that it would plan to veto that bill, in part because the Keystone XL pipeline is still the subject of a court case. It's still under review by the State Department. And so we may see President Obama exercising his veto power for only the third time in his presidency. And this would be, the first two times were bills that came to him with kind of technical flaws. So this could also be the beginning of possibly a lot of vetoes from this president.
Well, he's not going to have to veto it unless it passes. But you said before that Harry Reid feared that it might pass. Would you guess that it will pass?
I think there's a good chance that it would pass. Yes, because the Democrats still have the votes to filibuster this. But again, this is basically this is a move on behalf of one senator.
Mm-hmm. Perry, what are the politics of this? I mean, what do the polls say? What are the arguments against it? What are the arguments for?
The president and a lot of Democrats make two arguments. One, it has lays into for an environmental problem where you could have some kind of oil spill or something like that. That's the first problem. And the second one is there's a big debate over how many jobs this creates. And the president says essentially this creates a few thousand jobs that are very temporary. The Republicans say it creates a much bigger universe of 20,000, 30,000 jobs. So the big dispute is over those two issues, like whether it's job creation or not and whether it's environmentally damaging or not. Most of the polling I've seen suggests most people are for creating the pipeline. Mm-hmm. I don't think the president necessarily cares about that in this sense that you can tell climate change has become a bigger part of his agenda these last few years. Mm-hmm. And I think the cost benefit analysis for him is that there's an environmental risk and there's not much of a job creation project in his mind. There's not many jobs created compared to the environmental risk. He's been leaning for this review they've talked about has been going on for 4 years. If they wanted this to happen, they would have. If they wanted this review to end, it could end. And my suspicion is the president doesn't want it to end because doesn't want to approve this pipeline.
Well, Olivier, precisely. I mean, how much of a dodge is it to say we have to wait for the State Department to finish this review when it's been going on for so long?
I think the court case argument is probably a better one.
Mm-hmm.
That's an actual process that's unfolding. The State Department, we don't really know where they are in this process. Yeah. And it's very hard to find people in Washington who really honestly believe that the State Department is just chugging right along without any input from the White House or from political appointees at state. One thing though, I mean, I agree that this could be the start of veto happy part of the Obama administration. But one note of caution is that in recent weeks, White House officials have been playing down the importance of approving Keystone or turning it down. And they've been saying, look, this has become kind of a cause célèbre for environmentalists, but it really doesn't have that much impact. It doesn't have that much impact on jobs. It's a really small issue that's been blown out of proportion. And really importantly, they've been saying, look, we have all these upcoming executive actions and rulemaking on the environment that are much more important. They're looking at emissions restrictions on future power plants. The big one is on existing power plants. And so the fact that the White House is playing this down a lot now makes me wonder whether they might not just be able to swallow this.
And another possibility is that it could be a bargaining chip for getting the Republicans to move on some of these other issues that a lot of people argue are of higher priority and longer lasting impact.
So, Karen, what do you think about the public perception of a showdown between the White House and Congress on this and other issues? If you mentioned that President Obama has not used the veto very often, if he starts using the veto, if you get really tough reaction from the Republicans on the other side, is there going to be even more anger at Washington?
I think that's a real risk that they're running here. But there are a couple of calculations that, in my conversations with White House officials and people who advise them, have come up. One is that we're now setting the table for 2016, where the Senate map is going to be much more favorable for the Democrats, where there's a presidential race on the ballot, and there is a belief that the Democrats benefit by sharpening the distinctions between the two parties. The other issue is when the president had his news conference the day after the election, he said, "I hear you." And he said, "I also hear all those people who didn't vote." Well, a lot of those people were young people, were Latinos, were people who were disappointed in the Obama administration for not acting as much as they had hoped.
Well, it almost sounds as if neither the Republicans nor the Democrats nor the White House has gotten the message, to the extent that people are sick and tired of all this infighting. We're just seeing even more intense polarization in Washington this week than we did a couple of weeks ago.
The president said something interesting both Wednesday at the press conference and Sunday when he talked to Bob Schieffer. He said his vision of the presidency, essentially, we spend too much time focusing on do bills pass in Congress. And that's not the only way to get things done. And I think he signaled that he's going to use summits. He's going to use executive orders. I think his view of this is that the conflict in Congress over certain issues does not mean he should not work on them at all. And I think there's something to be said for that, is that there's a few more tools in the presidency, and ultimately, whether they have a trade deal, or not, is maybe not a great measure of progress compared to what happens on climate change, what happens on immigration, what happens on healthcare. It's not clear that necessarily we should define what happens in Washington based on whether Obama signed a bill that was bipartisan. The Iraq War was bipartisan. That wasn't necessarily a great achievement. I think they're trying to lay in the groundwork for the presidency can be defined and success can be defined in a different way.
You agree with that, Olivia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Karen's point about the president's message to people who didn't vote is really important. One of the problems for the Democratic Senate candidates this year is that, one, they came in at a time when Obama himself was on the ballot in his 2008, history-making presidential run, and he put together a very important coalition, and that coalition was always his and not the Democratic Party's. And if you look at the steps that they're taking now in the lame duck, you're starting to see an agenda that appeals heavily to young people. It appeals heavily to Latinos. And it appeals to a lot of American centrists and moderates. And I think it's the other point that I'm basically agreeing with Karen. The other point that's really important is you're starting to see a division between Democrats in Congress and the White House that's premised on this issue. Democrats in Congress are starting to say, what does Hillary want us to do? What does she need us to do here? What does she want us to do here? How does this play for both our map in 2016 and the presidential map? And if it happens to benefit the guy at 1600 Penn, well, maybe that's okay.
Karen, you had a really good piece on this. And one of the things that you pointed out is how different President Obama has reacted to these defeats from the way President Clinton reacted to defeats in 1994.
Yeah, it was interesting. In April of 1995, President Clinton had a news conference where it looked as though Newt Gingrich had become such a dominant figure in Washington that Bill Clinton actually had to declare the president is still relevant here. Well, within 12 hours of that news conference, a bomb went off in Oklahoma City, and it became very clear that the president was still relevant here. And President Obama himself was in a much more accommodating mood after the shellacking he got in the 2010 election. But what's different here is that President Obama never has to be on the ballot again, and he's also looking at his legacy. He, in addition to wanting to get things done, his advisor, Dan Pfeiffer, pointed out, he also wants to change the discourse in the country. He wants to leave as part of his legacy that no one else can ever run for president again being anti-immigration or anti-gay marriage, or a denier that climate change is caused by humans. And he thinks that's a very big part of his place in history.
Perry, before we move on to other subjects, what's happening? What's your view of what's happening on the Republican side? We have the incoming, who will be the new majority leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, basically shooting down all this talk of a possible government shutdown maneuver as a way to sort of put pressure on the White House. Will John Boehner in the House and Mitch McConnell in the Senate really be able to keep Republicans under control going forward?
That's the big question. That's the big question of Washington right now. It's like, if you have an immigration action that affects 5 million people and legalizes them, where does that go from here? You can tell Mitch McConnell said we're never going to have a government shutdown again, very explicitly. Kevin McCarthy, the number 2 in the House, said the same thing. We need to show that we can govern. We need to show we can pass bills. So that's the focus for them. But I think Obama's executive actions have been so aggressive, and his hints of them have been so aggressive, that the Tea Party wing is going to look for ways to confront him. So that's the big question: is where does that head, and how does Boehner balance that off?
Perry Bacon is political reporter for NBC News. I'm Tom Gelton. You're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. Well, Olivier, 2016, you just mentioned the last time that Democrats are wondering what Hillary wants them to do, but there's going to be a big competition on the Republican side as well. Ted Cruz, Paul, can Mitch McConnell keep them under control?
Well, it depends what you mean by keep them under control. He obviously can't get them to shut up. That's just not going to happen. These guys are media darlings. They're darlings of the conservative movement. They have their own power base. Mitch McConnell and John Boehner couldn't keep Ted Cruz from meeting with House conservatives and shaping the way they've responded to legislative proposals over the last couple of years. So under control is an interesting question, really. I think you're still going to see them speak out a lot. I think Rand Paul right now is in the process of modulating some of his positions before the 2016 run. He's already grappled with questions like, should U.S. aid to Israel be scrapped? He's done a 180 on that. He now says no. So Mitch McConnell is not going to keep them under control. The question is how much of an impact they're going to have on Senate day-to-day procedure, and I'm not totally clear on that yet. I'd be surprised if Ted Cruz decided to quit the battlefield entirely, though.
Karen, finally, some minor changes on the Democrat side as well. A new role for Elizabeth Warren. What's behind that? Senator from Massachusetts.
That I think is to give progressives a sense that they have a greater voice in the Senate leadership. It was interesting too, the optics of what we saw when the leadership team came out, that it's now a majority women. So it'll be interesting to see, because Elizabeth Warren has given voice to a very substantial part of the Democratic coalition.
Perry, we have a number of emails here on immigration. This is clearly going to be a hot issue. Jim from McLean is wondering whether there's any evidence that the Hispanic population that's eligible to vote wants amnesty and a path to citizenship for those Hispanics who are here illegally. You know, the conventional wisdom on the politics of this is that the Hispanic vote, that the Democrats didn't get as many Hispanic votes as they might otherwise have because President Obama had not moved more aggressively on immigration. Yet the Republican share of the Hispanic vote actually went up in this election in spite of their opposition to immigration reform. So, it's an interesting question here from Jim, whether we should just assume that the Hispanic vote wants this immigration to pass.
I don't think we have a ton of evidence to say because Obama delayed his executive action, therefore Latinos didn't turn out. Right. Latino turnout is low in a lot of elections, particularly Texas, for instance, has been low for a long time. I don't want to just one event shaped those things. And the question, I guess, gets at the polling does not necessarily tell us that if we do the executive action, therefore Hispanics will vote for Democrats more. In fact, they've been voting for Democrats more for a long time, and that probably goes to more Republican positions on immigration than anything else. If we have a situation where the Republican nominee says, I'm opposed to this action, and Hillary Clinton is saying, I'm for this action, I would think that would help her politically.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a lot of subjects to discuss. We have a very important Supreme Court decision, a couple of Supreme Court decisions that we have to talk about. We have a shakeup at the Veterans Affairs and we have gas prices coming down. We're going to take a short break here. When we come back, you can give us a call. We'll bring the callers on the line. Our number is 800-433-8850. My guests for this domestic discussion of news: Perry Bacon, political reporter for NBC News, former national political reporter at Time and the Washington Post; Karen Tumulty, the national political reporter at the Washington Post; Olivia Knox, chief Washington correspondent for Yahoo News. I'm Tom Gelton. We're going to take a break. Please stay tuned. Back. I'm Tom Gelton. I'm sitting in today for Diane Ream. This is the Friday News Roundup. This is the hour where we discuss domestic news. My panel consists of Perry Bacon from NBC News, Karen Tumulty from the Washington Post, and Olivia Knox from Yahoo News. And remember, you can watch this hour. We do have live streaming video on our website, drshow.org. You'll see that Olivia actually wore a tie for the occasion, even though it's your day off. Right?
It is.
Amazing. Yeah. So, let's go first to Antonio, who's on the line from Little Rock, Arkansas. Antonio, thanks for calling the Diane Ream Show.
Hey, how you doing?
Good.
Wow, I didn't think I would be the first caller, but hey, I think
You are. Congratulations.
Yes, sir. My topic or discussion I think I would like to talk about is immigration. My fiance is born and raised in Mexico. We've been together 10 years. She's been a hard worker. Yes, she's undocumented. My thing is, what is wrong with Congress? I mean, people have been over here more than 10, 20 years working, paying some sort of taxes when they go to the grocery store, when they fill up on the gas tank. I mean, even when they're working, they're still paying some form of taxes if they're not getting paid so-called under the table. So my thing is, what is Congress afraid of? The demographics? The demographics are going to change. Every 500 years, every country, the demographic of the people changes. If you go through history, through Alexander the Great, all the way up to the land that he conquered, the demographics change from one race to another.
Well, let me ask you this, Antonio, let me ask you this. Do you think that U.S. doors should be just open to anybody who wants to come?
where early in the 1900s, the flood of immigrants from European. Nobody made a big discussion about immigrants coming from the European part of the world that flooded America. So I think if the doors were open to European right now to let 20 million immigrants come from the European countries, I don't think we will be having this discussion on immigration.
Okay, all right.
Yes, it goes to a demographic, a race issue. The Congress doesn't want to work with Obama because 95% of Congress don't look like President Obama. So,
Okay, all
yes,
right.
I think the doors should not be wide open, but it shouldn't be shut tight either to allow people that want to come over here to work, to live, to help their families, to learn, to educate themselves, that already been here 20 some years, and, to just kick them out or deport them is just flat out wrong.
All right, we hear you, Antonio. Olivier, how much opposition is there really to immigration reform in the country? I mean, are the Republicans sort of wary of moving on this issue because, as Antonio implies, maybe are there people out there that are really resistant to the kind of immigration reform that the president is advocating?
Well, there are two really important issues that come up again and again as you discuss this issue. One is the sequencing of the process. Do you need to secure the border first and then create a pathway to citizenship for people who've been here for a long time? Do you take the Senate actually did pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill, and it's been dead in the House. But so they foresee a pathway to citizenship. So you've got the sequencing issue. The question about people who are, we had this question earlier about someone who's already in line, who's already going through the paperwork, who's going through that process. Do you require people who are here illegally to go home first and to become last in line? Well, how's that going to work? So I think there's opposition on a number of different grounds. The thing you hear most from Republicans is the prioritization of securing the border first and then tackling all these other issues. And then just how that pathway to citizenship or permanent residence status should go.
Karen, let's talk for a minute about what's happened in the Supreme Court this week. Last week, we found out that the Supreme Court is going to be taking up yet again the Obamacare issue, as you mentioned at the top of the show. This week, we learned that the court heard arguments in a challenge to Alabama's redistricting law, and that, of course, has to do with the gerrymandering phenomenon. How important is this case, and what do you expect to get from the court?
Well, it's a really interesting case because, as my colleague Bob Barnes wrote earlier this week, the way the court has approached the question of whether race can be used in drawing these district lines has been very complicated and sometimes contradictory. What's interesting about this Alabama case is that it is being brought not by conservatives, which is what we've usually seen, but by Democrats and African Americans who are saying that race should be less of an issue in redistricting, that the way the lines are drawn now, they are concentrating African American voters too much in some districts. So again, I think that this is an opportunity for the court to kind of once again address this issue and give us a much clearer idea of what they really think.
Barry, another issue is the Supreme Court on Wednesday lifted a stay on issuing same-sex marriage licenses in Kansas after a federal judge struck down that ban in Kansas. Are we going to finally get a definitive ruling from the Supreme Court that applies to the whole country on the legality of gay marriages?
I don't think we are. It looks like they're very comfortable and happy to let federal courts strike down gay marriage bans and then say, okay, that was good. And I think Ginsburg was actually quoted somewhere saying, there's no circuit split right now, so we don't have to get into this at all. I mean, I think we are sort of watching a kind of slow motion Roe v. Wade happening where they are essentially legalizing gay marriage nationally they seem like they don't want to make the big ruling themselves, but they're very happy to watch other judges do for them and then not comment on it. So it's very interesting to watch this process.
Good. Let's go now to David, who's on the line from Hedgeville, West Virginia. Hello, David. Thanks for calling the Diane Rehm Show.
Good morning to the panel and all. I had a comment on the XL pipeline. A lot of the opposition is from people that are worried about an environmental disaster, which, BP ex-NVLDs is a big problem. And I think any legislation that would approve these types of projects here, or when they get up starting to drill in the Arctic, as global warming allows the ice to disappear and they'll be looking for oil up there too, is that there'd be a requirement that the company that does it purchase an escrow in treasury bills equal to the estimated cost of a cleanup, so that if there is a disaster, and sometimes these companies just declare bankruptcy, whatnot, but this would be in escrow. It would be treasury bills that the government, issues, and if they were to have a spill, they would not get their money back until it was cleaned up, and that they would be required to keep this, but they would get the interest off of it. So
interesting suggestion, Olivier. Of course, we saw from the BP spill that there was a lot of dispute over culpability for that disaster and over who should pay for it. What do you think about this idea of an escrow fund to cover any damages from a spill?
Well, I mean, David has an interesting idea. I don't think it would really pass muster with the companies that are looking to develop this pipeline. We forget though that the bulk of the pipeline is being built. We're talking about is a relatively small stretch coming in from Canada. The environmental repercussions are potentially large, not just because tar sands, which is where they're getting the oil, is a rather dirty process, but also because of the risk of a spill. You hear a lot of Native American populations complaining what happens if suddenly there's a spill in this giant pipeline. Who's going to pay for the cleanup? But I don't think that we're going to see any major groundbreaking moves here in terms of corporate responsibility. And I don't think an escrow account would be all that feasible. How much would you estimate a spill would cost?
The representative from Tennessee said that the last major spill like that cost $1.2 billion. So that there is something that is an actual number that they could go to make their estimate.
Well, $1.2 billion is a lot of money to put in an escrow fund, isn't it? Karen, we've had a couple of callers who want to talk about Jonathan Gruber. Jonathan Gruber, for listeners who haven't been following the news, is a MIT academic who had a hand in putting together the Obamacare bill. Tell us how he got back in the news this week.
Well, first of all, it's important to understand who Jonathan Gruber is. He's an MIT economics professor who has developed a very, very sophisticated micro-simulation model that can really spit out numbers fast on healthcare proposals. His numbers were used by Mitt Romney in Massachusetts, Arnold Schwarzenegger in California, and he was at a conference and was talking about quite a while ago, but it was recently unearthed videotape where he during the writing of the Affordable Care Act, he was on contract to HHS to do that, to basically be able to give them numbers really fast. And he was complaining that that the way the process works, that there was a sort of lack of transparency that was politically necessary. And he actually referred at one point in his comments to the stupidity of the American voter. Well, this has really flared up on the right, and it is now being seen as an example of how the entire process was just done on subterfuge. It's really interesting for those of us who covered the writing of the healthcare law, because when I was covering it back in 2009, it was the liberals who complained most about Jonathan Gruber. So he has become a cause, and there are more of these videotapes coming out, and I would not be at all surprised if there are congressional hearings on this.
My guess is that there are some people out there that think that he used the word stupid sort of with reference to the wrong audience. I mean,
yeah, and
that was pretty stupid to say that, wasn't it?
And it was also, I think, and again, having had a lot of conversations with Jonathan Gruber over the years as I was covering healthcare policy, the sense I got was that he was talking about there's this kind of perfect model of the healthcare system that academics would like to see that is just politically impossible to implement. And so you very often with academics hear them complaining about how, politics is always getting in the way of good ideas, or at least what they think are good ideas.
Let's go now to Gabriella, who's on the line from Annapolis. Hello, Gabriella. You're on the Diane Rehm Show.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I want to talk about immigration. I am a Hispanic, and I am a PhD also in engineering. And it was very interesting to hear the comment from your guest on what the Hispanic population really wants. I am a Republican, and I think that we really need to put upside down the reform. For example, one of the things that I believe it should be removed from the immigration is the family association. Immigration should be based on the needs that the country have in terms of jobs. What are the professionals that we need? Do we need landscapers? Do we need engineers? Or do we need doctors? That is how it should be immigration based on the needs of the country, not just because I came here and I want to bring the rest of my family. I shouldn't be allowed to do that. That will have a more reasonable and more sensible way to do immigration.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Gabriela. You know, I'm actually working on a book right now about the 1965 Immigration Act, which is the one that put family unification at the top of the priority. And there was a big debate then, and it has continued for 50 years about whether the unification of families should be an immigration priority or should, as Gabriela says, the national economic needs of the country be what dictates immigration policy. Olivier.
Well, so one of the things that we expect to see in the president's executive orders is an increase in the number of visas for high-tech workers. H-1B is one of the more better known ones. It's something that a lot of Republicans' business allies want. It's something that a lot of people in Silicon Valley want. So there is going to be an element of quote unquote what the country needs here, what the economy needs here. But family reunification, I find it difficult to believe that Democrats in particular would be all that gung-ho about a policy that separates families, that if your kids are here illegally, then you deport the parents. And in fact, that's one of the things that the president's going to address directly.
Well, I'm Tom Gelton. You're listening to the Diane Rehm Show. I do think that the big issue in family unification is not so much parents and sons and daughters. It's adult brothers and sisters who actually are able to come here now by virtue of their sibling relationships. And that accounts for a lot of the immigration that's taking place. Let's go now to Eric, who's on the line from Greensboro, North Carolina. Hello, Eric.
Hello. I just wanted to say that I think the American voters are stupid, as stated previously. If you look at the exit polls, and also some of the constitutional amendments that were on the ballot, these voters that just overwhelmingly elected for Republicans tilt liberal when it comes to all these issues. And the reason for this disconnect in perception is that the media is not doing their job in educating the public as to who is who. And a good example of this is the Republicans tell these whopper lies, and the media does not challenge them on it. The Keystone Pipeline is a perfect example. Most people think that, and because it's been framed by the Republicans, that this oil is going to lower gas prices in America, and the oil is going to be used by Americans, and it's going to create 10,000 jobs. None of that is true. The oil is going to be shipped overseas. Okay. So can the media please start doing your job? I'm a truck driver. I made my deliveries this morning. I did my job. Okay. Now you do your job.
Thanks, Eric.
You know, I've got to say, I really get pretty frustrated with people who keep insisting the media is not doing its job. Every media organization that I can think of, every major one now has a massive fact-checking operation. I think the media is doing its job pretty darn well, but I think that the American public does not consume what the media. I mean, when a magazine cover, you know, that features a Kardashian is as they say, breaking the internet this week, you cannot blame the news media for voters not being aware of the issues.
Barry, we're almost out of time, but I want you to very quickly summarize what's happening at the Veterans Affairs Department, because an important reorganization is underway there.
Since the whole scandal about waiting times, they've reorganized completely. The big announcement this week was they're going to have a chief officer in charge of customer service, someone who makes sure that when you have an appointment, it happens, it's scheduled, and there's a big overhaul. Lots of staff going to be devoted to that. So the VA is thinking about how do we make sure that the hospitals work more efficiently and really are oriented like the way Target is on some level around customers being served. And so that's the big shift they made this week. They announced it on Tuesday.
And they're going to be trying to hire a lot more medical professionals to take care of this demand.
Exactly, because of the fact that you have these huge waiting lines that Congress was very upset about, and the president was, for that matter, earlier this year.
Perry Bacon is political reporter for NBC News. My other two panelists are Karen Tumulty from the Washington Post and Olivia Knox, chief Washington correspondent for Yahoo News. I'm Tom Gelton. Thanks to you all for coming in. Thanks for listening. This is The Diane Rehm Show.
The Diane Rehm Show is produced by Sandra Pinkert, Denise Couture, Susan Casey, Rebecca Kaufman, Lisa Dunn, Danielle Knight,